In the 1950s, America had broken free from the shackles of wartime economics. It was walking with the swagger of a nation that had the world by the tail. Scientists had harnessed nuclear energy. Jet-propelled airplanes were breaking speed records, and the race to space was on. But perhaps more than anything else, one thing melded imagination and consumerism, putting this era in perfect context. The concept car. Unlike satellites, rockets, and jet planes, these dream cars were accessible. People flocked to auto shows to see concept cars in their titanium-bodied glory. They were snapshots of how America perceived its future. They were simply out of sight, unforgettable. But what happened to them? Most were destroyed. Some just plain vanished. But amazingly, some are still here.
I mean, there's very little to the imagination about what this car is supposed to be. And if you put a long enough wing on it, it probably would fly.
We don't know how this car survived because in-house engineering prototypes are usually destroyed right away. This car, it is believed, was just put in a warehouse somewhere and forgotten about.
Reintroducing the 1954 GM XP-21 Firebird and the 1955 Mercury D-528 Beldone. (1954), just 1 year after U.S. Air Force test pilot Chuck Yeager became the first man to fly 2.5 times the speed of sound in the X-1 rocket plane. America tests the largest hydrogen bomb in its history at Bikini Atoll. The stage is set for GM to drop a bomb of its own. This is the 1954 XP-21 Firebird.
Firebird 1 was the first gas turbine car designed and manufactured in the U.S. at that time, so it was really cutting-edge technology. The only other things that had gas turbine engines in them were aircraft, and as you can see, the car is very much aircraft inspired. I mean, it was just such over-the-top design and engineering exercise that it was the buzz. This car was a huge image builder for General Motors from a technological standpoint, from reaching far outside of the box for powertrain.
This certainly is the future. Brought closer today by the Firebird.
The XP-21 Firebird was designed by legendary GM designer Harley Earl. It's no secret that aeronautical design was all the rage when it came to concept cars. A large tail fin here, a bubble top there. But Harley Earl and his design team took the Firebird XP-21 into a whole new stratosphere. There was nothing subtle about this car's design. This was, quite literally, a jet plane on wheels.
Harley Earl was a visionary that really could look forward, almost like he had a crystal ball. And very interesting the way this car came about. Aircraft is the inspiration of the day. Everybody's enthralled with transcontinental transportation. Air flight is a huge inspiration for people, and this car really tells that story. When you get up really close to the car, you really see the aircraft-inspired design from the latches to the canopy. And on the interior, very much aircraft. All the gauges are aircraft inspired. Even the steering wheel is a twin yoke style steering wheel. Stepping back a little bit here, we have the Whirlfire turbine power gas turbine engine. One of the most remarkable things about this, other than being a gas turbine, is the craftsmanship that went into building these engines in the early 50s. From the welds to the manifolding and the aluminum parts and stainless steel. It's just a masterpiece of craftsmanship. Moving back, you can see it's very aerodynamic shape, very much like an aircraft. Notice the Pinto style indicator or speedometer. And then has a speed brake where these flaps open up to help slow the car down. In the back is the exhaust system, which is very much like a jet aircraft. And the heat coming out of that is very much like a jet aircraft as well. You wouldn't want to be standing back there. It would probably set you on fire.
Plenty of concept cars in the 50s could talk the talk. But when it came to the walking part, forget it. They may have looked like jets, but they drove like cars, if they even drove at all. But the Firebird XP-21 was very different. It could walk the walk in a way that was completely revolutionary. This concept car not only looked like a jet, but with its fully functional turbine engine, it drove like one too.
Gas turbine engine is basically, if you look at a windmill that you see on a farm, the wind blows and the windmill spins. A gas turbine engine develops a tremendous amount of heat, about 1650 degrees, and it blows hot gas across an internal windmill. That windmill is hooked to a shaft which goes to a transmission, and that's what drives the vehicle forward. The unique thing about gas turbine engines is they'll run on a variety of fuels: gasoline, kerosene, fuel oil. One of the things that's unique about the gas turbine engine is its high RPM, which requires special manufacture. It runs at an operating speed of around 35,000 RPM and with an idle speed of around 15,000 RPM. This car sounds very much like a taxiing jet aircraft, small personal, something like a Learjet. It sounds a lot like a Learjet taxiing around. Has the same smells, the same rev up as a personal jet.
One problem with creating an operational turbine-powered jet plane on wheels is that somebody had to have enough nerve to drive it. With the XP-21 Firebird, there was a fine line between driving and flying. It was obvious that operating this concept car would require something more than your average dealership car jockey. GM engineers might have wondered, do we hire a test driver or a test pilot? Whoever GM hired to test drive it would have to have the right stuff. Eventually, this four-wheeled rocket was test-driven on the GM Proving Grounds in Arizona by Firebird supervisor Emmett Conklin. He personally researched the concept of a turbine-powered car for decades, so he was a natural choice. But there was another authorized driver, somebody with a slightly higher profile.
It was a very specialized car, and the last thing Harley wanted was somebody getting injured in this car. Most of the testing was done by three-time Indianapolis winner Maury Rose. So many of the pictures you see in film footage, this car has Maury Rose, the famous Indianapolis race car winner, driving it. He had the background with race cars, which enabled him to react quickly to a car with this kind of power.
So why weren't American citizens soaring down city streets in these wheeled rockets? Well, the engineering details that made this concept car so incredible are the very same ones that excluded it from any plans of mass production.
Along with the gas turbine engine and its unique capabilities, it is an expensive engine to produce. Mass production of an engine like this would require a whole line of vehicles. So you have to have a gas turbine economy to make them affordable. The cons on this vehicle are the power band. You go from 15,000 RPM at idle to 35,000+ RPM at cruise speeds. So there's a huge transition, about 15,000 plus RPM transition, which is pretty tough to convert to transmission power, to shaft power. Around town, it doesn't accelerate up and down as easily and as freely as a gas piston-driven engine does. But if you were to have this car out on a place where you were going to go for a long distance, it'd be wonderful.
In the end, there would only ever be one XP-21 Firebird. Over a decade later, the Firebird moniker would resurface in the much tamer form of the 1967 Pontiac Firebird. But the name was the only resemblance. Firebird 1, as it became known, didn't get mass-produced. But this outrageous concept car did produce a rich legacy. Within the next few years, GM would release 2 more Firebird turbine-powered concept cars. This groundbreaking turbine trilogy inspired a whole generation of automotive designers.
Certainly, you know, the tail fin design got crazier and crazier throughout the 50s, and some of that's attributable to the design of this car. Just about any 59 GM car has an exaggerated tail fin on it someplace. The tail fin design originally was an aircraft-inspired design from the famous P-38 Lightning aircraft of World War II, but that was probably the pivotal point in which aircraft design was translated into automotive design.
Every concept car usually has its typical 15 minutes of fame, but they don't all survive. The Firebird 1 did. In fact, it's never left the safety of GM's ownership. This car could have garnered astronomical amounts of money if put up for auction. But there is no price tag for a major piece of automotive history.
This was a huge car for General Motors, and you know, the success of this car drove the other 2 Firebird concepts as well, Firebird 2 and 3. The cars that were destined for the dump were generally cars that didn't really make an impact to begin with, but things like the Firebird were saved, and it was known from the very beginning that they were going to be saved.
(1955). Nuclear energy is sold commercially for the first time ever. American physicist Willis Lamb wins the Nobel Prize in Physics for his groundbreaking research on the electron, while American biochemist Vincent de Vigneault wins the Nobel Prize in Chemistry for the first ever synthesis of a polypeptide hormone. Research, ideas, and innovation are fuel for a nation where the sky appears to be the limit. The minds of the country seem to turn the wheels of progress effortlessly. America is advancing in every way imaginable, and the automotive industry is no exception. Car companies worked feverishly, designing outrageous concept cars to trot out at auto shows. But not every concept car felt the warm glow of the spotlight. In fact, some were never even meant to see the outside of a research lab. This is the 1955 Mercury D-528.
This car was designed by Ford to experiment with new technologies in air conditioning, rollover protection, and packaging of major components. This car blazed a lot of technology trails for Ford, but it was never seen publicly. It was something that Ford kept inside, in-house, that did not show the public because they wanted to experiment with all kinds of different things. Back in the early 50s and even into the late 50s, air conditioning systems were very, very bulky, and it was necessary to put giant evaporators in the trunk, which is about the only place that they would fit. Doing that and also trying to accommodate the spare and the gas tank took up a lot of room. So what Ford thought is, well, let's try some different packaging options here. Let's take, well, we don't have much choice. We have to leave the evaporator where it was. But what we can do is we can take the gas tank from the bottom and lower the floor, thus giving ourselves more luggage room. We can put the gas tank on one side, and we can take the spare tire out, giving us even more luggage room, and put the spare tire on the other side. The idea behind the air conditioning system was to channel the cold air up through the C-pillars and through a space in between the headliner and the roof. And there were progressively larger holes in the headliner beginning at the back and going towards the front. So the air conditioning, and as it went up in the roof, the high pressure air would come through the smaller holes first, and then as it got farther forward, it would go through the larger holes, and you would theoretically get a very even distribution of cool air gently descending upon you. The fact that we don't have air conditioning systems like that today kind of tells you where that technology went, but you have to give Ford credit for trying.
Despite the unique and handsome design of this concept car, the D-528 was the automotive equivalent of a lab rat. It was never given a proper name. It was poked and prodded in the name of research. But through the highs and lows of its experimental life, Ford researchers learned a lot from this car. The mistakes that were made behind closed doors gave Ford a great opportunity to ditch the things that didn't work and keep the things that did.
There were a few adaptations of technologies that were used on this car that made it into production cars. For example, the reverse sloping retractable rear window ended up on certain Mercurys and Lincolns of the 50s and 60s. And it was also used in Great Britain on the Ford Anglia, the little tiny four-cylinder power car with a reverse sloping rear window. The 4-cluster gauge nacelle on the dashboard ended up being used in the Thunderbird. Relocation of the gas tank did not make it into a production car because they took the gas tank from a very protected part of the car and relocated it to one of the most vulnerable parts of the car, the left rear fender.
In the world of concept cars, the show cars are the ones that get remembered. After their rounds on the show circuit are complete, their public exposure often helps spare them from the crusher. But experimental cars have a rough gig. Of all the concept cars, closed-door experimentals are the most vulnerable.
We don't know how this car survived because in-house engineering prototypes are usually destroyed right away because they have no useful purpose afterwards. They're usually pretty beat up. The company's done with them. They've done all the experimentation they can, and they break them up and throw them away. This car, it is believed, was just put in a warehouse somewhere and forgotten about by perhaps coincidence, maybe by design. Somebody liked it quite a bit and decided, well, let's hide it back here and let's not let anybody know we kept it. And it's very fortunate that that happened.
The D-528 beat the odds simply by staying in storage. It appeared destined to an afterlife of accumulating dust. But after only a couple of years in storage, something changed. Suddenly, the story of this lowly lab rat wasn't over after all.
When this car was about 7 or 8 years old, George Barris, the world-renowned customizer, talked Ford Motor Company into giving him some of their used-up, old, obsolete concept cars so that they could have another life in movies and television. This car came to George Barris in the same shipment that the Lincoln Futura did, and we all know that the Lincoln Futura ended up as the original Batmobile. And he got this car out and repainted it and reconfigured it slightly to star in a Jerry Lewis movie called The Patsy. And it was rigged with all kinds of opening doors and opening panels and things like that to give Jerry Lewis his usual hard time doing something. For its role in the Jerry Lewis movie, the car was called the Beldone, a name that most people call it today.
The Mercury D-528 Beldone is a true rags to riches story. A diamond in the rough, spotted, polished, and thrust into the Hollywood spotlight. If it weren't for George Barris, this car would never have seen the light of day. But even after the Beldone's unlikely rise to stardom, it was still almost lost to the obscurity of the private market. Before the Peterson Automotive Museum in Los Angeles, California, stepped in.
We were aware of this car for some time. It was offered to us for sale from a collection in San Diego, which is when I first went to inspect it quite a while ago. And over time, other collectors purchased it, and it was completely restored to its original Ford engineering configuration. And after a little while, the owner sold it at an auction, and Mr. Peterson acquired it at that auction. I like this car a lot, and probably for the same reasons that George Barris liked it. It's long, it's low, it's a really clean design. It's got some interesting features to it, and it's one of a kind. You can be the only one on the road driving this car.